I'm Carl Johnson, and I'm the director for the C.S. Lewis Institute in Chicago. The mission of the Institute is to live out the legacy of C.S. Lewis by developing disciples who will articulate, live, and defend their faith in Jesus Christ in both their personal and public lives. Sometimes this means tackling important questions such as, do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? Can Christians love their Muslim neighbors without embracing Islam? How do the Quran and the Bible compare? To answer these and other questions, we recently welcomed Dr. Andy Bannister at a special evening with the C.S. Lewis Institute. Dr. Bannister holds a PhD in Islamic Studies and speaks widely on both Islam and Christianity. He's an evangelist and apologist with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries.
Well, tonight the topic they've asked me to speak about and address this evening is this whole question of do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? And it's a very timely question because we live in a very pluralistic context, do we not? In modern America. In fact, in much of the Western world, we live in very pluralistic societies. Where I live in Toronto, and of course, here in Chicago, you can choose from almost any religion you care to imagine, all represented here in this very multicultural city. Here in Chicago, you can choose from Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, Judaism, Islamism, secularism. You could even be a Chicago Bears fan. I believe they call that masochism. And not going to be invited back, am I? But of course, that huge religious diversity, that massive religious diversity that I've just described there, of course, raises a question. It raises the question of how do you navigate the choice when you see this huge array of different religions on offer? How do you choose what to believe? How do you know what to believe? And one answer that I think I hear increasingly from many corners of society, and certainly coming through in the mass media very commonly, is the idea that, maybe the thing to do is just affirm that all the great religions of the world are essentially the same. That there are many paths to God. Believe whatever you want as long as you're sincere, and all these kind of ideas we hear in the culture. Whatever you do, don't tell other people that they're wrong, and so on and so forth. Now, I've got a friend who teaches at the University of Toronto back home, and he very much believes this idea. He very much believes the idea that all religions are essentially the same. And the metaphor he likes to use with his students, and I remember him once sharing this with me over a cup of coffee, and the metaphor that my friend at the University of Toronto likes to use is he says that, it's helpful to imagine, he once said to me, all the religions of the world as being a bit like paths up a mountain. There on the top of the mountain is a God. And all the different religions in the world are just like paths up the mountain. And there's the Buddhist path, and the Christian path, and the Muslim path, and the Hindu path, and so on and so forth. Presumably the atheist path goes just round and round the bottom and doesn't go anywhere. But nevertheless, it's a lovely metaphor. And I remember him sort of sharing it with me and sort of smiling kind of sort of philosophically and wisely at me over his cup of coffee and, waiting for my reaction. And I let him finish his little story. And then I said, I hear what you're saying, and I think it's a very pretty illustration. I said, but there's just one problem. The problem for me is this. I'm a mountain climber. My hobby is climbing mountains. It's one of the reasons I moved to Ontario in Canada. The mighty mountain ranges we have there. Few people who know Canada. That's very funny. The highest thing in Ontario is about 900 feet. But yeah, I'm a mountain climber. I climb mountains as a hobby. And I said to my friend, here's the thing. I can confidently tell you that every path does not lead to the top of the mountain. Some paths do indeed just go round and round the bottom. Some paths don't get outside the parking lot. They just go to the washroom. Some paths lead to the tea shop. Some paths end in massive cliffs and a rocky death because they were built by rock climbers. And quite frankly, rock climbers are the most insane people on the planet. And so on and so on. Every path does not lead to the top of the mountain. In fact, if you are lost on a mountain when the fog comes down and you've forgotten your map and your compass and your GPS has stopped working, simply picking a path at random and following it is probably going to end up in you being a small pizza-shaped stain at the bottom of the mountain. It's not a way to wisdom so much as a way to certain death. And then I asked him another question. I said, but just for a minute though, let me entertain your idea. Tell me, I said to him, where would you have to be standing in order to see that every path leads to the top of the mountain? Well, he thought about it for a moment and he said, oh, I think I see your problem. Yeah, you'd have to be standing at the top of the mountain, wouldn't you? I said, no, Jeff, it's worse than that. Because when you're on the top of the mountain, when you're at the summit, you can't see where all the paths go because they often disappear over the edge. The only place you could be to see that every path leads to the top of the mountain, you'd have to be floating several hundred or even several thousand feet above it, doing a kind of Google Earth type view. Now, given that you said that God is the summit of the mountain, where precisely are you located, and who on earth do you think you are? He hasn't used that illustration in some time since we had that conversation. But nevertheless, the idea that all paths lead to the top of the mountain, is an interesting one. You hear variations of it. But one of the other problems with it, of course, it also neglects and overlooks many of the differences between the world's religions. You see, the more you study comparative religion, the more you begin to notice something. It doesn't take a lot of study to discover that the great religions of the world are not superficially different with fundamental similarities. It's the other way around. They are superficial similarities with fundamental differences. And interestingly, all the major religions of the world have a claim of exclusivity built into them. It's not just Christianity that claims to be the only true path to God. Islam claims to be the only true path. Judaism claims to be the only true path. Hinduism and Buddhism are exclusive faiths too. And sometimes claims of exclusivity, claims that when we hear somebody saying, I believe I am right and other people are wrong, sometimes that makes us a little bit nervous, particularly in the postmodern world in which we live. But I don't think it should make us nervous. Because there is something about the very nature of truth that means it is exclusive. If 2 plus 2 is 4, that means 2 plus 2 is not 7, 19, or 4037.2, no matter what some economists may try and tell you in today's financial climate. Now, when it comes to religious truth claims, exclusivity is everywhere. And certainly when it comes to Christianity, exclusivity is built and wired right into the DNA of the Christian faith. The claim that the God of the Bible and Jesus Christ are unique is everywhere. It's wired across the whole of the Bible. It's built into the very heart of the biblical story. Let me show you what I mean. If you go to the very start of the Bible, the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible, you'll find in Exodus chapter 15, verse 11, the account of an amazing song, an amazing hymn that is sung by Moses and the Israelites to celebrate the great rescue that God has performed, bringing them out of Egypt and through the Red Sea and to safety. And in the middle of this amazing song, hymn of praise they sing to God, we read these words: "Who among the gods is like you, O Lord, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? Who among the gods is like you? There is nobody like the God of the Bible," says the Old Testament. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, we read even more exclusive words. In the book of Isaiah, a little bit further on in the Old Testament, we read these incredible claims. "For this is what the Lord says, He who created the heavens, He is God. He who fashioned and made the earth, He founded it. He did not create it to be empty, but He formed it to be inhabited. And He says, I am the Lord, and there is no other." Pretty strong claim of exclusivity. I am the Lord and there is no other. And then when we move from the Old Testament into the New Testament, we encounter famous words like these, falling from the lips of Jesus Christ himself, who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to God the Father except through me. Now, that shocking claim, isn't this incredibly narrow-minded? Isn't it tolerant? Isn't it bigoted? Isn't it restrictive? How can Christians possibly hold on to claims of Jesus like this when we live in a world of so many different religions and truth claims? Isn't it more tolerant? Isn't it more progressive? Isn't it more inclusive to say, like my friend Jeff at the University of Toronto, that all religions are the same? Well, I want to explore this idea a little bit this evening using Islam as a test case and using this whole question I set up at the start of this evening really as a window into the much bigger question of the uniqueness of the God of the Bible and the uniqueness of Jesus. Why is Islam a great test case? Well, firstly, because I've been studying Islam academically for about 20 years now. It's outside of my own faith. It's the religion and the faith that I think I probably understand, or think I would like to think so, that I understand the best. But it's also a great test case because there is a persistent belief, certainly held by my Muslim friends, many of them, certainly held by some of my Christian friends, and certainly a belief that you see popping up in the popular culture time and time again, that Islam and Christianity are fairly similar. And one of their similarities is this idea that the God of Islam, the God of the Quran, is the same as the God of Christianity, the same as the God of the Bible. They are essentially the same God. And the question I want to explore tonight, this evening, is simply, does that idea stand up? Does that idea stand up? See, one of my colleagues who teaches at Oxford University, Os Guinness, a very well-known writer, some of you may have heard of Os or encountered his teaching before, he once said something very interesting. He says, contrast is the mother of clarity, by which he's saying when you compare two things, you often understand them both a little bit better. And it's one of my contentions that when we look at the God of the Quran and when we look at Islam, for those of us who are Christians or know a little bit about Christianity, we can actually see Christianity more clearly because we're comparing it to an alternative worldview and an alternative religious system. And so what I want to do this evening really is look at four claims that the Bible makes about God. Four claims and four ideas that are central to the biblical understanding of who God is. Ideas actually shared by both Jews and Christians in many cases. And then show how, when we look at the Quran and what it has to say about Allah, about God, how very, very different its understanding of God is. Let's begin with the first one. The God of the Bible is a God who is relational. He's a relational God. We see this from the very start of the Old Testament. If you turn to the third chapter of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, you discover something fascinating. Immediately after, the God of the Bible has made everything. He's created the universe. He's brought atoms and particles and the laws of physics into existence. He's created planet Earth and the ecosystem and animals and plants and seas and oceans, and culminated in that the pinnacle of creation, human beings, you and I. The God of the Bible, what does he do next? Well, according to the Old Testament, he's found walking and talking in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. He steps into creation and begins relating to his creation. You read a few chapters on in the Old Testament and you discover that God walks and talks with Abraham. He walks and talks with Moses. In fact, the book of Exodus says that God would speak with Moses face to face, like a man speaks with his friend. Further on, God speaks with his people throughout the Old Testament, in fact. And then when human beings disobey God, when a gap opens up in the relationship between human beings and God, and that relationship between human beings and their Creator is fractured and damaged, well, the rest of Scripture and the rest of the Bible is a story of the relational God searching humankind out, pursuing us, rescuing us, wanting to restore us into relationship with Him. And the whole end of that, the whole purpose of that is set out in the very last book of the Bible. And the penultimate chapter of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, chapter 21, verse 3, sets out this incredible vision of what heaven will be like. Heaven, according to the Bible, is not a place where human beings sit on clouds playing harps with the angels for eternity, but is a place where, once again, there is relationship with God. And we read, the dwelling of God will be with men, with mankind, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. God is primarily not interested in us merely believing in him or keeping his commandments, important as those are. But the biblical cry on page after page is that we might be in a relationship with him. And that's what it means to be a Christian, to be a follower of Jesus, somebody who is in a relationship with God and can, as Jesus taught, call God Father. Well, that's the Bible, the God who is relational. What about the Quran? What does the Quran have to say on this topic when it comes to the question of God? Well, really, the Quran does not describe Allah, does not describe God in relational terms. You can read the 114 chapters of the Quran, and this is pretty clear, that the Quran really describes a God who is distant and, to some extent, remote. Transcendent is the theological term. Nowhere in the 114 chapters of the Quran does the Quran ever invite its readers to enter into a relationship with God. That invitation is not there. Furthermore, the Quran borrows and retells many biblical stories that turn up on the pages of the Quran. And one of those stories is the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. The Quran retells that story 7 separate times there in the text. And when it retells the story, there are some similarities, but there are also some differences, some changes that are made in the Quran to the biblical story. And one of the noticeable changes is that beautiful passage in the Old Testament that describes God walking and talking with Adam and Eve is removed. God does not walk and talk in the garden with Adam and Eve. Interestingly, when you read some of the quite beautiful in the Arabic, the descriptions of paradise, of heaven there in the Quran talks about things like rivers of wine and beautiful fruit trees and crystal clear fountains and other kind of things that are there in its description of paradise. But one thing is missing. There is nothing like that verse I read you from the book of Revelation in the Bible. God is not present in the descriptions of paradise there in the Quran. What is waiting the faithful Muslim in heaven is not walking and talking with God. He is not that kind of relational God. And of course, the Quran flat out denies on page after page after page that God took on flesh and stepped into history in the person of Jesus Christ. The God of the Quran is missing, as it were, from the beginning of history, missing from the end of history, and missing from the middle of history. The only relationship that the Quran talks about in terms of human beings and God is one not of father or friend. That language is never used in the Quran. The only language that's used is that of master and servant. God is the master, we are the servants. Our job is simply to obey, not to have any deep intimacy of relationship. Now, don't take my word for this. I'm a Christian scholar of Islam. I'm British, and the British are known for being arrogant and intolerant. I saw who laughed. I saw who laughed loudly down here. We can talk afterwards. Let me share with you some words from a leading Muslim scholar writing today, Shabir Akhtar, actually based for a while here in Chicago, now teaches at Oxford University. I think the last time I touched base with him. And in a book that Shabir wrote a few years ago, he makes exactly the same point that I've just made to you, but from the Muslim perspective, writing as a Muslim scholar. And I think his words are very helpful. He says, Muslims do not see God as their father. Men are servants of a just master, but cannot, in Orthodox Islam, typically attain any greater degree of intimacy with their Creator. Fascinating and honest words. They're just servants, in other words. In contrast, it's interesting that Jesus Christ specifically said to his followers, I no longer call you servants, but I call you friends. And that relational difference, I think, lies certainly at the heart of the difference between Christianity and Islam in its understanding of God, but it also actually in many ways lies at the heart of the difference between Christianity and every other religion, certainly that I've studied, and in many ways reveals Christianity to be far more than just a religion. And in fact, I'm often asked the question, do all religions lead to God? And increasingly, when I'm asked that question, I like to look my questioner in the eye and say, you know what? I don't think any religion leads to God. I don't think any religion leads to God. Only God can lead you to God. And that is what Christianity claims has happened in the person of Jesus Christ. And it's a claim utterly unique as far as I can see. So the God of the Bible is a God who is relational. Secondly, he's a God who can be known. He's a God who reveals himself and can be known. Now, here's the interesting thing. I don't know if you've noticed this, but it's only possible to have a relationship with somebody if they make themselves known. Have you thought about this? If you were to walk out of here this evening, if you've come on your own this evening, if you're single, if you're married, this thought experiment, don't engage in it, there'll be trouble. You walk out of here this evening, you're on your own, you're single, and you see across the hallway as you walk out of here a person of the opposite sex, and you look at them and you think, my word, what a wonderful specimen of humanity. They're very attractive, they're very handsome, a bit like me, very kind of thank you, one person, and you think to yourself, I'd love to get to know that person. Maybe go for a coffee or a date or something. There's definitely chemistry. And you make a few inquiries, you find out who their friends are, and you stalk them on Facebook. That's how dating happens, I understand, in the modern world. And anyway, and it turns out there's a bit of a problem. The person that you are attracted to, the person who has kind of captured your imagination, is a basically quite nervous person. They only ever come out of their room, their apartment, maybe once or twice a year for an event like this, or maybe to, I don't know, go to the doctors or something. The rest of the time, they just hide away in their room and they, order everything they need on Uber Eats and never set foot outside. And so, apart from, of course, when they attend meetings with the local Agoraphobics Anonymous Society, problem is that's a closed-door meeting, and that's a quality joke. Thank you very much. I'm here a week, and. So the problem is this, though. You can't get to know them, can you? Because they've hidden themselves away. You couldn't have a relationship with that person because they haven't made themselves known. They've hidden themselves. In order to have a relationship, the person that you want to relate to has to be willing to make themselves known. And this is interesting. This doesn't just apply to human beings. That applies to God. If God were to hide himself away in heaven, not reveal himself, just give us brief clues to what he's like, no form of relationship would be possible with him. And here's the thing that fascinates me. From the beginning to the end, the Bible tells the story of a God who reveals himself, who wants us to know him, a God who can be known. The God of the Bible doesn't just reveal his intentions, his will, and his commandments, but the God of the Bible also reveals his character, his heart, his very own self, his very identity. I alluded a few moments ago to the story of Moses and his kind of relationship with God. And one of the most famous stories in the life of Moses is that powerful encounter that Moses has at the burning bush, where God speaks to Moses personally. And what does God do? He reveals to Moses not just commands and instructions, but he reveals to Moses his very own name, Yahweh, which the rough English translation of that is the one who is, I am, the self-existent one. And ultimately, that biblical theme of God revealing himself and his identity, his very own self, runs right the way through the Bible and culminates perhaps most beautifully in in John's Gospel, there in the New Testament, chapter 14, verse 9, where Jesus looks at his followers, looks at his disciples, and says to them, anyone who has seen me, says Jesus, has seen God the Father. Well, not only does the God of the Bible reveal his name and his character, his very own self, because of that willingness of God to reveal himself, to be known like that, he can ask us to reciprocate and to know him. And so in a passage like Jeremiah 9, verses 23 and 24, there at the heart of the Old Testament, we read this incredible verse of the Bible where it says, let not the wise boast of their wisdom, nor the strong boast of their strength, nor the rich boast of their riches, but let the one who boasts boast in this, that they understand and know me, says God. The God of the Bible is a God who reveals himself and asks us, invites human beings into a relationship where they might know him, not just know about him, but know him. Now, what about Quranic theology? What about what the Quran says about Allah, about God? Do we see anything similar? Well, no, once again, we see that the Quran's understanding of God is significantly different, at least on this issue, to the biblical understanding. The God of the Quran is not a God who can be known personally. Nowhere is that offer, that invitation to know a God in a relational term ever extended. God in the Quran does not reveal himself. He reveals his commands, yes. He reveals his instructions and his will, yes, on page after page. But he does not reveal his self and his very own heart. It's interesting to note that in Islamic theology, Muhammad, to whom the Quran, according to Islamic understanding, to whom the Quran was revealed over 23 years from AD 610 to AD 632, Muhammad never has God speak to him personally and reveal the Quran. It's the angel Gabriel who in the Islamic understanding comes down and gives the Quran to Muhammad over that 23-year period. God is at a distance. God is up there in heaven, human beings are down here on earth, and never the twain shall meet. Again, the Quran retells biblical stories on frequent occasions, and the story of Moses and the burning bush is there in the Quran. But the Quran has changed the story. And God does not reveal his personal name to Moses, does not speak to Moses face to face like a man speaks with his friend. That has all been changed and all been rewritten in the Quran's understanding of that story. Profound difference. Now again, don't just take my word for this. Let me quote to you a very well-known Muslim scholar of the Quran, a gentleman called Ismail al-Faraki. And he wrote this a few years ago. He said, Allah does not reveal himself to anyone in any way. Allah reveals only his will. Allah does not reveal himself to anyone. That is the great difference between Islam and Christianity. And I found that I love that quotation because it's so honest and it's so direct and it sums it up almost better than I could. That is the great difference between Islam and Christianity. I acknowledge that as a Christian, and Ismail acknowledges it as a Muslim, that in the Quran, God only reveals his commands, not his character, not himself in any way. So the God of the Bible is a God who's relational. He's a God who can be known, and that's absent from Quranic theology. Let me show you a third difference. The God of the Bible is a God who is love. The God of the Bible is a God who is love. This is a crucial and key and central biblical theme. And it begins right there in the Old Testament. In fact, Exodus 15, we were there a few minutes ago, that song of praise that Moses and the Israelites sing as they worship God and thank him for rescuing them from Egypt. In the heart of that song, they sing this verse, this line. They sing of God's unfailing love that has led God to redeem his people. And that theme of the love of God runs through the Old Testament and runs on into the New Testament, where it's perhaps summarized and culminated and reaches a climax in 1 John 4, verse 16, where we read one of the shortest verses in the Bible, where we're told, God is love. Now, that's one of those verses of the Bible that in one sense sounds very simple, but is actually really profound. Because what the Bible is telling us here is that the God of the Bible is not just a God who acts lovingly, he is a God who is love. In his very nature, in his very essence, he is love. And to get all theological and all philosophical on you for a moment, the God of the Bible is a God who is Trinity, one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And one of the interesting things that flows from that means the God of the Bible can be a God who is love without the need to create anything. Because before God had created anything, any human being, any creature, anything other than himself, he could still be love. Because the Father could love the Son, could love the Spirit. God could consistently and self-subsistently be loving without creating anything. At the heart of who the God of the Bible is lies a loving relationship. And in Christian theology and thinking, love is the supreme ethic underpinning the universe, because everything stands upon and was created by and was founded by a God who is love. Well, what about the Quran then? And this topic of love and God. What does the Quran have to say on this subject? Here things get a little bit different. The Quran certainly talks about love, and I'll unpack that in a moment, but nowhere does the Quran make that bold definition, that bold statement that Allah, that God is love. Nowhere does it say that. Neither does it even take the slightly reduced step of saying that Allah is loving. Those claims are missing. They're not there in the Quran. Interestingly, again, to get all theological and philosophical on you for a moment, the Quran denies the doctrine of the Trinity, that core understanding of God found in the Bible. And one of the side effects of that is that means that the God of the Quran couldn't be love unless he first created something to love. Love requires a subject and an object. It requires the one doing the loving, and it requires the object, the person that you are loving. And the God of the Quran could only be a loving God if he first created something other than himself to love, which is a philosophical problem that kept early Islamic theologians up at night in the first 300 or so years of the Islamic era. But there's an interesting feature, though, about how the Quran does talk about love and God. The Quran does use the word love in connection with God. In fact, it uses the word about 28 times. It uses the Arabic word for love and attaches it to something about God. And I did a little word study on this a few years ago, and there's something quite interesting going on. Of those 28 times that the Quran uses the Arabic word for love and connects it to God, something interesting is going on. 22 of those occasions are negative. That's about 79% of the times the Quran uses the word love to apply to God. It's negative, by which I mean the Quran describes the kind of people God doesn't love. God doesn't love the rebellious. God doesn't love the unfaithful. God doesn't love those who disobey. God doesn't love those who go wrong, those who boast, those who are ungrateful. The list goes on and on and on of the people that God does not love. Of the 6 remaining times, which are more positive, where the Quran uses the word love, it's to tell you what you have to do to earn God's love. God will love you if you are obedient. God will love you if you first do something for him. God will love you if you are faithful. And nowhere is there any offer of unconditional love, any sense that the God of the Quran takes the first move in loving. Everything is based on us first loving God. And in fact, so I think nervous and unsure of itself is the Quran in talking of the love of God that many Muslim theologians have actually come right out and said it is perhaps better for Muslims not to use the word love when talking about God. Here is a gentleman called Murad Hoffman, well-known Muslim scholar, who has written widely on this very, very subject, in fact, and at a conference in the Middle East a few years ago, said this. He said, Allah is self-sufficient. This fundamental self-description excludes that Allah is in love with his creation. It is safer and more accurate not to speak of love when addressing his clemency, his compassion, his benevolence, his goodness, or his mercy. It is safer not to speak of love, he says in this article he wrote. You know, that's a profound difference, fundamental difference from the God of the Bible, who we are told on page after page after page loves even the sinner, even the rebellious one. This is perhaps most beautifully illustrated in one of the most famous stories that Jesus ever told, the so-called parable of the prodigal son, illustrated here in this very, very famous painting by Rembrandt called The Return of the Prodigal. And if you've ever read that story in Luke 15, or if not, go read it sometime, it's a beautiful story of a father who had two sons, and both sons abuse him and let him down and are rude to him and dishonor him. And one son by kind of running away and wasting half of the family inheritance on wild living, and the other son by being so uptight and moralistic and hyper-religious that he basically doesn't return his father's love. And Jesus told this parable, and in the story that Jesus told, the father represents God, but he has this incredible love for both of his rebellious sons. And Jesus used it to describe this incredible love and offer of forgiveness that God extends even to those of us who are far from him, even to his enemies. In fact, elsewhere in the Bible, we read these incredible words. God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, while we were still his enemies, while we wanted nothing to do with him, Jesus Christ died for us. Central claim of who the God of the Bible is. So the God of the Bible is a God who is relational. He's a God who can be known. He is a God who is love. One last crucial thing that the Bible has to say about God, and that's that the God of the Bible is a God who has suffered. Now, before I unpack that a little bit, I want to tell you why this is important, and perhaps one of the most important things that the Bible has to say about God. It's important for this reason. We live in a world where there is suffering and injustice and brokenness and pain, and we only have to open the newspaper or turn on the television or immerse ourselves in Twitter for more than about 30 seconds, and you could find near daily examples of the mess that we as human beings have made of the world that we find ourselves in. Now, the interesting thing is, faced with that kind of world, God could sit up there in heaven and look down on what we've done and say, well, I'm glad I don't live down there, quite frankly. Look at the mess those idiots have made of the world I created. Well, the God of the Bible is not that kind of God. The God of the Bible is a God who has not stood aloof from this world of suffering and pain and injustice and evil, but a God who has stepped into that world and done something about it. And in so doing, has taken evil and suffering into himself and has suffered in the process and knows what it means to suffer. And that's hugely important when you experience, as we all will at some point in our lives, suffering or injustice or evil or any of those kind of things. Let me illustrate why it's important with a story. The gentleman on the screen behind me bore the remarkable name of Horatio G. Spafford. He actually lived here in Chicago, and he was a Christian lawyer, very successful in business. He'd made a lot of money. He was very influential politically. He'd been involved as a younger man in the abolition movement, and that had won him lots of friends and influence. He was very well known in church circles. Very, very successful man. Well, as well as all of that success, he had a wonderful family. A wife called Anna, to whom he was devoted, a young son, and 4 beautiful daughters. Everything was going well. It was going well in business, in politics, in family life for Spafford. And of course, easy to be a Christian, easy to be a believer in God when life is that good. Well, in the 1870s, everything began to go wrong for him. In 1870, tragedy struck. His businesses suffered a number of setbacks, and he lost a lot of money. But more importantly to him than that, his young son contracted scarlet fever and died quite rapidly. His wife, Anna, also fell ill, and she almost died. And after a 3 or 4 month battle with illness, through which she finally pulled through, they decided they needed to do something to take their mind off everything they'd been through, the death of their son, the business disaster, her sickness. So they decided they would do the sensible thing. They would have a holiday. And they booked a vacation, they booked a trip to go traveling and see the great sights of Europe. Now, at the last minute, a business emergency arose, and Horatio had to remain behind here in Chicago. So he sent Anna and the 4 daughters on ahead on one ship, and Spafford would follow behind a few days later on a second ship, and they'd be reunited on the other side of the Atlantic. That was the plan. Well, on the 22nd of November, 1873, the ship that his wife and daughters were on struck another ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and sank to the bottom in just 12 minutes. Hundreds of people lost their lives in that tragedy. Anna was one of just a handful of people who were picked up and rescued. She was taken to Cardiff in Wales in the United Kingdom, from where she telegraphed home to Horatio here in Chicago these words: "Saved alone, whatever shall I do?" Horatio took the very first ship he could get a ticket on, get a place on, across the Atlantic Ocean to be reunited with his wife. And in fact, as they sailed across the Atlantic one afternoon, the captain sent a message to Horatio from the bridge, and it read like this: "Sir, a careful reckoning has been made, and we believe we are just more or less passing the point where your wife's ship was wrecked 6 nights ago. The water here is 2 miles deep." That night, Horatio shut himself up alone in his cabin and wrote the words to one of the most famous Christian hymns that has ever been written. Those of you here who have any connection with the church or would call yourselves Christians may well be familiar with this hymn. These are the words that he wrote that night. "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. For me, be it Christ hence to live. If dark hours about me shall roll, no pang shall be mine, for in death as in life, thou wilt whisper thy peace to my soul." And you read that famous hymn, whether you're hearing it for the first time or you know these words well, and then you hear the story behind it. And to me, it staggers my mind every time I sing this hymn now. Because you have to ask yourself the question, how could Horatio Spafford, having just lost his entire family, almost seen his businesses wiped out, all of this stuff, write words like that? How could he do that? How did he find the comfort in the midst of utter bereavement and loss to write those kind of words? And I believe the answer is that only the God of the Bible, whom he followed and worshipped and held dear, can comfort like that, because only the God of the Bible actually understands suffering. See, in Psalm 23 and numerous other biblical passages, we are told in the Bible time and time and time again that God is with us in the midst of our suffering. He's not aloof and remote and removed, but right there with us in the middle of it. And he can journey with us and understand it because he understands and has been through suffering in the person of Jesus. You see, God in the person of Jesus steps into history and goes to the cross, takes on suffering and pain into himself because of his great love for us. You see, the love of the God of the Bible that I spoke about a few minutes ago is a love that is not just spoken about, but is demonstrated in the incredible lengths that God goes to deal with the sin and the shame and the brokenness and the alienation that separate us from him. The Bible tells us that God is moved by our pain and our suffering, that he grieves for his people, grieves over our rebellion and our alienation and our disobedience and the distance that we have from him. And that was why in Jesus and the cross, God decided to do something about it. God paid a price to deal with our brokenness and our rebellion and to bring us the offer of forgiveness and reconciliation to him. And as the Bible says in the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, verse 4, he took up our infirmities, and he carried our sorrows. The God of the Bible is a God who has been through suffering, who has experienced it, who knows what it means, and was willing to do that for you and for I. What then of the Quran and its understanding of God on this particular issue? Does the God of the Quran, is he a God who understands suffering? Well, this is perhaps the most clear of the differences between the Quran and the Bible when it comes to the subject of God, because the God of the Quran is not a God who has suffered. Nowhere do we read that Allah in the Quran, that God in the Quran feels any grief or emotion as a result of our sin or our pain or our suffering. Certainly God in the Quran gets angry when we go wrong. He gets angry at our sin, and that anger is expressed in wrath and judgment, but there is no heart response. And the God of the Quran does nothing, takes no action, no steps, pays nothing, experiences nothing, goes through nothing to deal with the problem of sin and rebellion that separate human beings from him. And as the Muslim theologian Muhammad al-Bakawi puts it, discussing this very issue, he says Allah can annihilate the universe if it seems good to him, and he can recreate it in an instant. He receives neither profit nor loss from whatever happens. If all infidels became believers and all the wicked pious, he would gain nothing. And if all believers became infidels, it would not cause him loss. Indeed, as you read on in the Quran, you discover that not merely has the God of the Quran done nothing about the problem of sin and injustice, but according to Quranic theology, human beings, we must carry the weight of our own sin, hoping that on the day of judgment, the good deeds that you do, the obedience that you carry out, outweighs your disobedience and your rebellion, and you can basically pay off your own debts. As the Quran puts it in Surah Al-Isra 17, verse 15, no bearer of sin can bear the sin of another. Although I've always found that a fascinating verse, because when I was first dialoguing with Muslims back in my early days of studying the Quran, my Muslim friends would quote me this verse and say, you see, the cross and what Jesus did, paying the price for your sin, is impossible. No bearer of sin can bear the sin of another. And then it struck me, the interesting and enigmatic clue, even there in the Quranic text. Because what about one who is not a bearer of sin? Could one who is sinless bear the sin of another? And the interesting thing that many people are not aware of is that one of the things that Christians and Muslims have in common is some of the things that we do believe about Jesus. Because Islamic theology has always taught since the very beginning that Jesus is the only human being who was ever sinless. The Quran hints at that idea, and it's unpacked in later Islamic theology. Could it be that a sinless one has borne our sins that we could not bear ourselves? So when you look at the God of the Bible, all of these themes play together when you look at what the Bible says about God. The God of the Bible is a God who's relational. He's a God who can be known. He is a God who is love, and whose love has been demonstrated in what he has done to deal with sin and rebellion and suffering and pain. Huge contrast to the Quran's understanding of God, where we see a God who is not relational, a God who cannot be known, a God who is not love, and a God who is not willing to take on our sorrows and our infirmities. But there is one last difference between the God of the Bible and the God of the Quran that I want to speak about for a few moments. And this last difference that I want to talk about for a few moments concerns mercy and justice. Mercy and justice. You know, it's interesting that God's mercy and God's justice are ideas at the heart of many religions. Many of the world's religions will tell you that God is a God of justice who punishes wrongdoing, and that also God is a God who is merciful and forgiving. And in fact, the Quran on page after page after page says that God is merciful and forgiving, and that also God is a God of wrath and judgment. And we see both things talked about there in the Bible as well, that God is a God who is the judge, and God is also a God who is forgiving. But I wonder if you've ever thought or noticed something about mercy and justice. Mercy and justice contradict. Have you ever noticed this? Mercy and justice actually contradict one another. Mercy is always offered at the expense of justice. Let me illustrate what I mean. If you were to walk out of this building this evening, and as you walk out of the exit, you are grabbed by the Chicago Police Department, and they've caught you for that heinous crime that you committed last week. You know, the one that you've been hiding from all your friends and family. A few people laughing rather too nervously. And you're brought before the court tomorrow, and before a judge and a jury of your peers. The evidence is presented, you're found guilty, and the judge, she looks down at you from her bench, and she says, well, this is a very serious crime that you've been found guilty of, and according to the law of the land, I have to sentence you to 20 years in prison. Is the punishment this crime deserves. I am known as a judge who is completely fair and completely just. I believe in justice, I believe in the law, so 20 years is what you're going to get, and they send you down. Well, the judge has been just, right? She has followed the law to the very letter. She has been a just judge. Has she been merciful? No. Has she been forgiving? No. She's been just. Well, now replay the scenario. You walk out of here this evening, you're grabbed by the police, they take you to the court tomorrow, you're found guilty by a jury of your peers, the judge looks at you from her bench, and she says you have been found guilty of a heinous crime according to the law of the land, you should be sentenced in prison for 20 years, but you know what? Today I'm feeling forgiving and merciful. There's the door of my courtroom, get out of here before I change my mind. And you run as fast as your little legs can carry you. Now, has she been merciful? Of course. Has she been forgiving? Yes. Has she been just? No. She's ignored the law. She's quite literally ignored the law. She's ignored what it says. She's done the complete opposite of what the law says. She has not been a just judge, but she's been forgiving. And the more you play with this idea, the more you see it is obvious that mercy and justice are in contradiction to one another. Mercy is always exhibited at the expense of justice, and the same applies to God. Justice and mercy contradicts. If God treats us as our behavior and our sins and our rebellion deserve, then he is a God who is just. On the other hand, if God forgives us, he has to do it by ignoring everything that we've done, and he may be a forgiving God, he may be a merciful God, but he is not a just God. And this problem, this contradiction between mercy and justice, between forgiveness and judgment, is a contradiction in every other world religion. Every world religion, this is a problem, except one. Christianity solves this contradiction, solves this tension between mercy and forgiveness, and it does it through the cross of Jesus Christ. Because in Christianity, God does not offer mercy at the expense of his justice, but God offers mercy through his justice, through the justice of the cross, where judgment and mercy meet. The Bible says that God stepped into history in the person of Jesus Christ, and that Jesus offers to make himself one with those who trust him. And when we put our trust in Jesus, says the Bible, then our sin, our rebellion, our wrongdoing becomes his sin. He takes the injustice we have done into himself, and he pays the price. At the cross, every sin was punished, every penalty paid in full. Justice is upheld, not ignored. The law is fulfilled. At the cross, Jesus paid for us, and only because of that is mercy possible. See, the Bible is clear on page after page after page that God will judge the world. And everything that has been done will be brought out into the light. Every injustice, every sin, every evil, every secret thing, every wrongdoing will be punished because God is a God of justice. See, if we are forgiven and welcomed into God's heaven, it won't be because God has looked at what you've done and gone, yeah, I know, it doesn't matter. I'm a God who can just play fast and loose with justice. You will be welcomed into heaven on one criteria only, because in the cross of Jesus Christ, God has passed judgment on what you and I have done, said it is worthy of death. And then if you are one with Jesus Christ, he takes your place and takes the blow on your behalf. We are forgiven because sin matters. It matters so much that Jesus paid a tremendous price to deal with it. If we accept Christ, we are forgiven because he has paid. If we reject him, we will be judged and we will pay. Either way, the price of justice has to be paid for God to be a God who is just. Interesting illustration that could help you get your heads around this. If you were to come up to me afterwards, after tonight's talk, and say, Andy, could I borrow your iPad for a couple of minutes? Now, just imagine in some alternative universe, I lend it to you. I'm very, very attached to my iPad. I use it to play Candy Crush Saga in the washroom and all kinds of other really important activities. You ask me to lend you my iPad against my better judgment. I do so. 5 minutes later, you come back to me going, I kind of broke it. And I look at it, and I'm very upset, and I say to you, this is terrible. I mean, I'm a great fan of Apple products. I know everything about them, and I can tell you that what you've done, that way you've bent this thing and smashed it up, and goodness knows what you did to it and how, that's about a $500 repair. $500 to fix what you've done. And at that point, you begin crying, and you say, woe is me, I am but a poor student, or whatever. I don't have 2 cents to rub together. I can't afford to pay. And then I look at you, and I take pity on you. And I say, you know what, my friend? Don't worry. Don't worry. I will pay. I'll pay. I've got it covered. Go. Off you go. If you trot and hop and skip out of that building and then proceed telling people and tweeting and everything and saying, hey, guess what? I learned an amazing lesson tonight. You can smash up iPads and there's no consequences. It's free. You would have taken entirely the wrong lesson from what you would have seen, because there has been a price. What you did had a cost. All that has happened is that I have borne it so that you can go free and your debt is paid off. And that is what the Bible says is going on in the cross of Jesus Christ, that Jesus paid for us so that we can go free. That is what God did because of his love for each one of us. You know, one very last thing. I've talked a lot about love this evening. We talked about love just then. We talked about love as one of the attributes of God. It's interesting to reflect on the word love for a moment. In particular, I'd like you to think about this question for a moment. What is the greatest expression, the greatest form of love that you could possibly imagine? What would be the absolute greatest form of love that anyone could show? Now, interestingly, Jesus actually was asked a question that kind of led to that. Jesus talks about that towards the end of his life, where when he was discussing this issue with his followers, with his friends, he comes out with this line, and I think it's right on the money. He said, greater love has nobody than he is willing to lay down his life for his friends. And most of us instinctively get this. Yeah, you know, self-sacrifice is the highest form of love. That's pretty much obviously the case. If my 3-year-old daughter, who I love dearly, but who, as like most 3-year-olds, has a tendency to run in all kinds of random directions, especially when your back is turned, took it upon herself to bolt out of our open front door, run out to chase the neighbor's cat out in the street, just as the garbage truck comes thundering by, and I see what is happening, and I dash out of the front door, grab her and throw her out of the way, but as that happens, get struck by the truck, and am killed instantly. What would you conclude from the actions that have just taken place? You would conclude, presumably, that I love my daughter tremendously, that without a moment's hesitation, I was willing to sacrifice my love for my daughter Katrina, who means so much, incredible much to me, because of my great love for her. How deeply Andy loved his daughter, you would say to yourself, I imagine, because he laid down his life to save hers. We instinctively know this. Or consider a historical example. The man on the screen behind me, Maximilian Kolbe, very, very famous Catholic priest back in the 20th century. Why is he famous to students of history? Well, he was a Polish Catholic monk, was arrested by the Nazis, arrested by the German Gestapo in Poland. He was arrested because he and his fellow monks had been hiding Jews and other enemies of the German state and smuggling them to safety. And the Gestapo caught up with him. They arrested Kolbe, and he was shipped to the notorious Auschwitz concentration camp and imprisoned there. Well, 1 year after his imprisonment, there was an escape attempt at the prison. 3 prisoners, in fact, successfully escaped from Auschwitz. And of course, the authorities were very, very furious. And to deter further escape attempts, to deter further prisoners from trying the same thing, the commandant, the commander of the camp, gave the order that 10 men should be just picked at random from among the prisoners and executed. Not merely executed, he sentenced them to be locked up in an underground bunker with no food, no water, no light, and just left to die. Well, one of the 10 men who was selected at random to be killed to deter escape attempts was a friend of Maximilian's. And when he was selected, when his name was read out, this friend of Kolbe's cried out, "But my wife, my children, don't, I cannot be killed. I have a wife, I have a family." And on hearing that, Kolbe stood up and said, "May I take his place?" And that was permitted. and he was locked up in the underground bunker with 9 other men and proceeded to take 2.5 weeks to die of starvation and dehydration there in the dark. And you read the story of what he did that day in 1941, and those words of Jesus come rushing back to you. Jesus said, "Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." And if we all instinctively sense that's true, we know that's true, we look at heroism like that and go, that is what love looks like. That raises a fascinating final observation about God and God's character. You see, if God is truly a God of love, if you believe that God is a God of love, then of course God, because he's God, is also the greatest possible being, the very greatest being who exists. That's what it means to be God. And that therefore means if God is going to demonstrate love, then the form of love that God demonstrates must be the highest form of love. How could it be that mere mortals like you and I could be more loving and demonstrate a greater love than God can? That is nonsensical. So if the greatest being, God, demonstrates the greatest form of love, and the greatest form of love is to lay down one's life, do you now see why the death of Jesus, God come in the flesh, is so profound in what it tells us about who God is? You see, if Jesus is who he claimed to be, not a mere man, but God come in the flesh, God stepping into space and time, God getting his feet dirty with the with the dust of the world, and his nails bloody with his hands bloody with the nails of the world, then what we see in his willingness to go to the cross to deal with our brokenness and our sin and our rebellion and our hang-ups is the greatest act of love by the greatest being, a God who loved us so much that even while we were his enemies, he loved us so much that he was willing to do that. So the God of the Bible, I believe, is a God of love. He's a God who loves each one of us here this evening, loves you profoundly and tremendously so. He knows what you are like. He knows what I am like. There is nothing that you can hide from him. You can't distract him or blow smoke in his face by pretending to do a few good deeds and go, look, I'm a nice person, really. When God knows what you're really like on the inside, there is nothing you can hide from him. Yet despite knowing what you and I are really like, God came into the world and offers to make us one with him, pay for what we have done, and offers us forgiveness as a gift. But not just any gift, a very, very, very costly gift. A price was paid for our forgiveness, but we didn't pay it. We didn't earn it. It was the greatest possible act of love by the greatest being to demonstrate the greatest gift of all, forgiveness and mercy, but not at the expense of justice, while justice was upheld. You know, I quoted to you earlier from Romans chapter 5, where it tells of the love of God, but there's another very famous verse in the Bible that talks of God's love. One of the most famous things that Jesus said here in John's Gospel, chapter 3, Jesus said, "For God so loved the world, that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." You see, if God was merely an abstract principle, if God is merely a philosophical idea, if God is some distant deity sitting up there in heaven who has never stepped into space and time and taken action, quite frankly, that God would be fundamentally irrelevant. But the God of the Bible isn't that kind of God. The God of the Bible has stepped into history in the person of Jesus, and that changes everything. Because the God of the Bible is relational. The God of the Bible can be known. The God of the Bible is love. The God of the Bible has suffered. The God of the Bible is truly merciful and truly just and is truly love. And there is quite simply no other God like him. Thank you for listening so kindly and so patiently.
The God of the Bible is a God of love, and he is a God who suffers on our behalf. Os Guinness once said that Christianity is the only religion whose God bears the scars of evil. There really is no God like the triune God, and at the C.S. Lewis Institute, it's our goal that you discover this truth personally. And if this truth is a reality for you, it's our mission to help you grow into that truth and to live it out. We'd love to encourage you further in your life of discipleship, so please let us know how we can minister to you and your church. You can find us at cslewisinstitute.org/Chicago. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion.